Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us today. Today, our distinguished seminar speaker is Dr. Roison Stanbrook, and Rosie is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Central Florida, where she started in 2018. She did her PhD at the Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK, and during that time, she spent 3 years in Africa, in central Kenya, and did her master's in Tanzania. And she discovered 4 new species, which is really cool. Rosie is a conservation entomologist and specializes in dung beetles. And she has lived on 3 continents and sampled insects all over the world, including African savannas, Honduran cloud forest, the British Isles, the Mediterranean basin, and across Southern Europe. Her research now is funded by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture and focuses on the ecosystem services provided by dung beetles in Florida ranch lands and the economic cost of dung beetle decline. Thank you, Rosie, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Betsy, for that wonderful introduction. Okay, let's get started, folks. So today we're going to be talking about the causes and consequences and counting the cost of dung beetle abundance losses in US working lands. I know a lot of you are thinking, what is a dung beetle? For those of you that live in Florida, we have around 29 species that are currently resident. And we have 3 different types of dung beetle. So we have dung beetles that live directly underneath dung pats. They're known as dweller dung beetles or endocoprids, and they bury and nest within the dung just below the dung pat. And you probably don't see them that often unless you look. The second type of dung beetle that we have here in Florida are the roller dung beetles. And I think a lot of people, you might have seen them when you're out and about rolling away little balls of dung poop. And then the third type of dung beetles that we have in Florida are the tunneling dung beetles. And these guys tend to be larger than the rest of the other dung beetles, and they dig tunnels just below the dung pat. And they move dung from the dung pat down into tunnels beneath the dung pat where they lay eggs in the little dung balls. So in Florida, we have a range of species from tiny dung beetles ranging at about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch, all the way up to the very largest dung beetles, which can be over 1.5 inches. The most abundant tunneling dung beetles are both introduced and native, and they are Digitonthophagous gazella. So this dung beetle up here, who has a little stripe on his back and has been introduced from East Africa. And then the others are smaller, darker beetles, such as Onthophagus hecate, which is commonly seen on the ranch lands, such as the ones at Buck Island. The most abundant roller dung beetles that we have is this little guy down here called Canthon pilularius. It's kind of got a blue-black sheen on his back, and he's the one that you often see rolling the dung balls away on ranches. All these dung beetles are a mix of diurnal, so they only operate and fly during the day, and nocturnal dung beetles, which only fly and dig their tunnels and locate dung during the night. The larger dung beetles that you see here have quite a large flight capability. So the largest dung beetle here, Dichotomius carolensis, has been known to fly up to 2 miles to locate dung during the nighttime. It's also kind of a special beetle because, as you can see, it's quite large, but it's also one of the dung beetles that we've been trying to track here in Florida. So you can see most recently, it's only been spotted in these 5 locations since the 1990s. And this is a huge change in abundance since the 1930s, where it has been estimated that this one dung beetle alone removes 21 pounds of dung per acre and could bury and excavate over 126 pounds of soil per acre in Florida. And now we're just down to this beetle having been spotted 5 times since the 1990s. So if any of you see this dung beetle around wherever you are, please take a photograph of it and let me know. And my contact information is on the very last slide of this presentation. Okay, so why are dung beetles special? Well, dung beetles are special because they provide several ecological functions. So these ecological functions range from dung removal, removing dung from the soil surface, nutrient recycling and improving soil fertility. So when the dung is removed, you've seen that they bury this dung underground, and the dung degrades underground and releases nutrients into the soil. Secondary seed dispersion, which basically means if there's any seeds in that dung, the seeds are buried in a little dung packet underground and ready for germination. And then fly and gastrointestinal parasite control. When dung is removed from the soil surface, it limits the amount of eggs that flies and other parasites can lay in the dung. And it kind of puts a stop to a lot of the parasite cycles that we see in our ranchlands. So around 20 odd years ago, the estimated contribution by dung beetles to ecosystem services was estimated to be around $360 million US per year. So ecosystem services can be commonly defined as the benefits that us humans get from our environment. These services could include such things as the food that we eat, clean water, recreational services, having lots of nice land and woods to go out and hike and walk in. And then the provisioning services. So they're the kind of services that dung beetles provide, such as dung removal, nutrient recycling, parasite suppression, and soil aeration. And we can see from the figure here on the right-hand side that actually the amount of nutrients that dung beetles put into soil can be quite a lot. We can see here, so the top line here is a large abundance of dung beetles versus when no dung beetles are present. And we can see that for nitrogen alone, they can increase the amount of nitrogen that's going into the soil. So now we're going to talk about dung and why having an animal working for free on our lands is great, because dung can be a huge problem in working lands. So cattle can produce around 6% of their body weight in dung every single day. It's not really a fact that many of us think of a lot, but it is a huge, huge issue. If you think about it, that means that each animal every year can produce 9 tons of dung. And the dung of just 12 cows can cover 1 hectare in a year if it isn't broken down. Bearing in mind, average herd size in Florida as of 2017 was around 2,500 head of cattle. So why aren't we covered in dung? Well, so dung naturally degrades over time. So we can see here from time decreasing from top to bottom that in the first 1 to 3 days, nothing really happens to the dung pats if dung isn't degraded. But over time, over the course of around 6 months, dung will reduce almost by 1/3, and then you're only left with a little tiny amount of dung left. So not only is this dung, when it lies on grass, covering available forage in pastures, we know now that cattle avoid up to 6 times the area of grass surrounding dung pats. Obviously, cows don't like to eat dung, but they actually avoid 6 times the area. So when we calculate how much grass and how much forage is actually being left ungrazed by cattle, we calculate the area of the dung pat plus 6 times the area of the dung pat, because we know cattle just won't graze that area. So how much forage is actually smothered by dung pat fouling? So if we have here, we've got our cow coming along, and usually we know that cows drop around 12 9-inch dung pads every day, depending on season. And if those dung pads aren't degraded, what does that pasture look like by day 2? So as well as the original 12, we can see that by day 2, we've got another basically 24 undegraded dung pads. So if we can extrapolate that to what a pasture would look like if dung wasn't degraded by day 178, you can imagine that there wouldn't be enough grass left for cows to graze. So, sorry, skipped ahead there by accident. So we designed a study to actually look at ecosystem services by dung beetles in dung removal in cow-cattle pastures. So we chose 2 different managed agroecosystems. We chose a natural system, and then we chose a managed system. So a natural system will be one that has cattle grazing on it, has very, very low pesticide use, very low veterinary drug use. And then we consider a managed agroecosystem as one that has cattle grazing on it, but they are given veterinary medication, and there might be other pesticides and insecticides used on the land. And we wanted to compare dung mass removal between these 2 landscapes. So we simulated a dung mesocosm experiment where we could look at what would happen if dung beetles were completely absent from both of these lands, and what would happen if dung beetles could operate normally under different abundances. So what we found was that on average, between the natural lands and the agricultural land, that dung was removed, 70% of the dung was removed from the soil surface after 3 months. You can see here that this is what a fully accessible dung pad looked like. Just so the dung is broken down, there's very little left, it's kind of dried out and aerated. And then this is what the enclosed pad looked like. So the enclosed pad represents what would happen if dung beetles were absent. And you can see the pad is still intact. You can see a little bit of mold and debris on top of it, but generally the pad looks almost identical to the day it was dropped. So overall, we found that there was a significant difference in the proportion of dung removed from natural and managed lands. More dung was removed from natural lands. We also looked at whether more dung was removed from canopied sites within natural and agricultural lands versus those in open pasture. We found that more dung was removed from canopied sites versus open pasture sites. We found that dung beetle abundance had a significant effect on dung removal. But dung beetle species richness, so the amount of different species in each site, was not a significant predictor of dung removal. And we found that small-bodied dung beetles, so these little tiny guys, had the largest effect on the quantity of dung removed from the soil surface after 3 months. Usually we would have assumed that the largest dung beetles, the dung beetles that probably bury around their own weight, if not more, in dung, would have the largest effect. But in this case, an abundance of smaller body dung beetles actually had the largest effect on dung removal. So I know you're thinking, great, that's amazing. But what does it actually mean? What benefits, as a ranch owner or as a landowner, what would it actually mean for me? So the next logical step from the initial experiment was we would convert the value of this ecosystem service into a dollar value. To do this, we calculated the cost of dung that remained on cattle pastures and the cost to ranchers that all this dung smothering forage would cost. And we calculated this under 3 scenarios. So when dung beetles were completely absent, extinct in grazing lands, when dung beetles were in low abundance, so when they were functionally extinct, so when they were there, but there wasn't enough of them to actually carry out their functionality to the full extent. And then when dung beetles were in high abundance and able to remove and bury dung normally. And this is what we found. So if we were looking at extending grazing before pasture rotation, you can see here that obviously dung pats naturally shrink over time due to weathering and other effects. So there's no real difference in the area lost under natural pat shrinkage. When dung beetles were absent, there was no extended grazing days before pasture rotation. In managed areas, so that's in areas that had a lower abundance of dung beetles, there was 86 days saved per year. And then in natural areas with a higher abundance of dung beetles, there was 123 days saved a year, which basically meant in areas that had a higher abundance of dung beetles, pasture grazing, grazing could be extended in pastures another 123 days per year. We then converted this number into a dollar value. And we found that under natural decay and under a higher abundance of dung beetles, the avoided forage lost due to dung beetle action is actually worth 1.3 million US dollars to Florida. But we also found out that when dung beetles, if they were completely absent from our pastures, completely absent from any of our working lands, we would lose almost $2.3 million worth of ecosystem services per year, which in the scale of things is great. The Florida agricultural industry is worth over $1 billion a year. And to say that this one insect group is contributing almost 2.3 million towards that is fantastic. So moving on, we know now that dung beetles are great. They're great at dung removal. They're great at nutrient enrichment. They're great at aerating the soil. But what do we need to do to actually allow dung beetles to persist in agricultural landscapes? So we looked at 3 central Florida ranches that contained different proportions of canopy cover and agricultural land use. And one of these central Florida ranches was Buck Island. And we assessed the proportion of canopy cover in the ranches and within 2 kilometers of ranches. And we also assessed how much inhospitable habitat in the form of intense agriculture was actually in the 2-kilometer area surrounding each ranch. So just to pivot quickly, we know that like much of the country, Florida is due to get warmer in the decades ahead. So when we were looking at the amount of canopy cover in ranches, what we were really looking at was the potential for thermal refuges in cattle pastures. So dung beetles generally have a really narrow thermal niche, which basically means they tolerate a very narrow set of temperatures for survival. And they require different microclimatic conditions that are kind of only really found in habitats with tree canopy cover. We know that there's a marked reduction in the abundance and diversity of dung beetles in land uses that don't have any canopy cover at all, much like some cattle pastures. And this is important because in general, dung beetles can only really persist up until around 38 degrees Celsius, and they perish at around -2 degrees Celsius. This is the dung beetles in Florida. And the temperatures that we find in open pastures can generally touch around 35 degrees Celsius, the ground temperature, but the temperatures found in forested areas can be much, much lower. And this is important because higher ambient temperatures result in a lower flight activity patterns and less dung foraging. If dung beetles are too warm, they don't fly. We can see here from this great paper by Jimenez Gomez et al. 2020 that dung beetles, when they fly, they use their thoracic muscles. So these are the muscles that, if we were looking at, for example, a chicken, the thoracic muscles would be akin to the chicken breast. So they use these thoracic muscles to actually enable them to open their wings and take off and fly. And when dung beetles are too warm, they can't actually do that because they'll overheat. So when we looked at the amount of tree cover, we looked at the tree canopy footprint within each ranch and within a 2-mile radius surrounding each ranch to see how connected the tree canopy patches were, and then what proportion of each ranch and surrounding landscape actually contained potential thermal refuges for dung beetles. And you can see Buck Island is here on the left, and we've got 2 major patches of trees in the landscape, as well as some kind of more distributed further along in the middle. Another ranch that we assessed, actually Duranda Ranch has a more tree canopy cover that's more widely dispersed within the ranch. And then this is a Longiner Ranch here that actually has a huge proportion of tree canopy cover within the ranch. Outside the ranches, we can see that there is some tree canopy cover. This is Longiner Ranch again. There's more tree canopy cover outside this ranch. And then Durando has a lot of tree canopy cover up in the top right here. We then looked at the amount of intensive cropping surrounding each ranch. And we would call intensive cropping as any kind of monocultural system that uses herbicides, pesticides. And Florida's intensive crop footprint is actually pretty high. It won't be any surprise to any of you to find out we're the #1 citrus provider in the whole of the United States. We're also the #1 sugarcane provider and the 3rd peanut provider in the whole United States. We also harvest over 200,000 acres of melons and potato crops. And also over 400,000 acres are devoted to free tree and fruit nut crops. So intensive agriculture in Florida is a big business. So when we actually look at how land surrounding each ranch is used, we can see here, for example, that to some extent, each of the ranches have some sort of citrus footprint surrounding each ranch. You might not be able to see here, but Duranda Ranch has a little citrus grove just right up at the top here. Obviously, Buck Island Ranch, any of you that has driven through the ranch entrance knows that there's citrus right outside. Longiner Ranch also has a small citrus footprint. There's other crops that are also being cultivated within the landscape. There's sugarcane directly outside and inside. There's row crops, so that's your tomatoes, squash, corn, watermelon. And then one of the ranches, Longiner Ranch, also has conifer plantations within it. So when we looked at the impact of all of these stressors on dung beetles, so the amount of intensive agriculture and the proportion of tree canopy cover in ranches, what we actually found was dung beetle abundance and species richness is actually affected by the amount of citrus crops surrounding ranchlands. Dung beetle diversity was affected by the intensive cropping systems. However, conifer plantations and the sugarcane did not affect dung beetle populations. And we found a greater tree canopy footprint was associated with a higher dung beetle richness and abundance and diversity in Florida ranchlands. So the take-home message here is like it's really important to at least keep some proportion of ranchlands with tree canopy cover, whether that be palmetto hammocks or live oak hammocks distributed throughout the ranchlands. So in general, we think that the simplicity, landscape simplicity and the agriculture intensity has indirect effects on dung beetle populations on the broader scale. We think now that the protected non-agricultural land surrounding these 3 ranches, so for example, Mayaka State Park and Kissimmee Prairie State Park, are actually providing a lot of the dung beetle populations that are found on these 3 ranches that we studied. These locations have larger amount of canopy cover, and they're also ivermectin free, and they have a diverse range of dung types alongside cattle dung. So there's a diversity of resources for dung beetles to feed from. Looking at this table or this figure here down in the bottom left, we can see that actually due to a development and conversion to agriculture, so cropping systems, Florida in the last 20 years has lost 27% of its tree canopy cover. And most of this tree canopy cover has actually been converted into housing and also these monocultures. So outside these ranching systems, it's as important as ever to maintain habitat connectivity and stepping stones between viable habitats such as these these state parks into ranches. And you can see from the previous figures that ranches are more likely than ever to be surrounded by inhospitable habitat in the landscape matrix. And it may mean that in future dung beetle migration from these state parks across the landscape into our ranches will be more difficult, and that will result in fewer breeding age dung beetles reaching ranches to provide these essential ecosystem functions that we've just spoke about. So what are the threats to long-term dung beetle persistence? So I'm almost certain that a lot of you here have heard of this insect apocalypse. So the ecological Armageddon that with a dramatic decline in insect numbers that has been touted about in the media for the last 2 or 3 years. It's true that a lot of this is hyperbole, but what we do know is that insects are declining around 2 to 3%. So terrestrial insects are declining around 2 to 3% per decade since the late 1970s. And there's many reasons for that. So when we look at the death by 1,000 cuts as posited by Wagner et al. In their paper, it comes from having deforestation and expanding agricultural land use. Obviously, climate change and global warming is having a huge effect. And then pollution and the spread of invasive species is also causing a decline in our insect numbers. But one thing I'd like to talk about is the effect of insecticides and pesticides. So when we look at the main threats to dung beetles specifically, the main threats are the expansion and intensification of agriculture, the loss of dung beetle habitat, climate change, and then excessive chemical contamination in the form of ivermectin and doramectin. So the US isn't unique to this problem. Other developed nations have also seen a decrease in their dung beetle numbers. In Italy, there was a decline in over 30% in the amount of roller species in the 20th century. A similar decline has been seen in France and Great Britain, and also in Finland. In Finland, several species have basically gone extinct since the 1960s. This is the current position of what we're looking at in Florida. So we've been looking at abundance data, species richness data from various sites all the way across Florida. And we've looked at the abundance of dung beetles caught historically going back from the 1960s. So you can see here on the y-axis that literally there was hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dung beetles recorded in the 1960s. And then a drastic reduction in the 1970s and the 1980s. Barely anything since 2000, around 20 years ago. It's suspected that one of the culprits of that is a veterinary antiparasitic called ivermectin, or its brand name would be Ivomec. And we know that dung beetles that eat ivermectin that has been excreted by cows, but that still contains threatening residues in them, they grow into adults that have smaller bodies and have less fat on their bodies. I know generally people don't think of an insect as having fat, but there is still cuticle fat and muscle fat that dung beetles have on their bodies. It also appears that these differences are greater in females than in males, and right now we're not really sure why that is. Dung beetle also has ivermectin has important effects on dung beetle reproduction, meaning that fewer offspring are actually produced by dung beetles that have ingested ivermectin. Ivermectin also decreases the olfactory response in dung beetles. So dung beetles don't have noses. Dung beetles smell dung by using the antennae on their heads. So they have little clubs on their antennae that pick up the chemical signal of dung, and then that enables them to navigate towards dung. So dung beetles that have ingested ivermectin can actually smell dung to locate the dung piles easily. We know that dung beetles that have ingested ivermectin, they alter their foraging patterns. So ivermectin is a neurotoxin, and it actually means that dung beetles are taking longer to fly to freshly deposited dung pads when they're exposed to ivermectin. This is an example taken from a Spanish study, and I know the quality isn't that great, but here you see a dung pad that has been treated with ivermectin, a really high dose of ivermectin. And around the dung pad, you can see like a brown, almost brown coffee beans. Unfortunately, these aren't coffee beans. They're dung beetles that have died from ingesting ivermectin on the dung pad, and they've just surrounded the dung pad and died. So you can imagine that obviously with ivermectin having all these effects are translated into the ecosystem functions that dung beetles provide. So this great study by Kavanagh and Manning in 2020 found that the presence of ivermectin actually reduced dung removal in treatments by around 47%, which basically meant that 47%, almost half of the dung wasn't removed by dung beetles that had ingested ivermectin. They did the treatment with dung beetles alone, fly inhabiting dung beetles, and then dung beetles and flies together. And they found that dung colonized by flies was not significantly affected by the presence of ivermectin residues, but dung beetles were significantly affected. So ivermectin, even at really low doses, can cause sublethal and lethal effects. So obviously a sublethal effect would be anything that doesn't really kill the dung beetle, but impedes its ability to find dung, reproduce, and actually be able to forage for dung. So this study, Verdue 2015, actually looked at how much ivermectin in dung has an effect. So they looked at a maximum dose of 200 micrograms per 1 kg of dung. And they found that dung beetles died almost 3 months earlier than those that didn't ingest ivermectin. They also found that there was a higher rate of ataxia. So ataxia being dung beetles that have a lack of coordination and impaired movement. And this didn't really change much over treatments. So we can see, so T200 means that there's 200 micrograms of dung per 1 kg of dung, 200 micrograms of ivermectin per 1 kg of dung, and then T100 basically means there's 10 micrograms of ivermectin per 1 kg of dung. And the results kind of level off even after that little amount. It's also worth noting that ivermectin sticks around in dung. It just doesn't disappear from the dung pat once the cows have excreted it. So there's around 200 micrograms of dung still in the dung pat after 3 days. So bearing in mind, dung beetles died 3 months earlier after ingesting 200 micrograms. After 12 days, there's on average around 50 micrograms of ivermectin in each dung pat. And then that drops off to around 6 micrograms per kg after 28 days. Verdú et al. Actually detecting negative effects of ivermectin at concentrations as low as 3.3 micrograms of ivermectin per 1 kg of dung. And this was seen in dungs that had spontaneous jerking responses. So obviously I said before, it's a neurotoxin. So dung beetles would spontaneously contract and their legs and wings at just this very low dose of ivermectin. So we know how great dung beetles are. We know what we have to do to keep dung beetles persisting in our ranchlands. We know that ivermectin has a really bad effect on dung beetle longevity in ranchlands. So what are the solutions that we can use to support our dung beetle populations? So one way of doing it is, instead of dosing every single cow with ivermectin, if there's any way to take fecal egg counts or blood tests to actually assess the parasite burden and then only treat those animals that need it, that's one option. Another option is to cull those animals that are susceptible to parasite burdens. Develop a parasite control plan using treatments that have lower toxicity. So instead of using ivermectins, use moxidectins. So an example of those would be Cydectin or Safeguard. Keep animals off clean. If you've dosed animals, keep animals off pastures for at least a week after any treatment. And that means that any dung that's dropped will have a lesser ivermectin content in dung. Obviously, be aware that longer acting products such as doramectins and ivermectins affect dung beetles long after you've dosed your cattle. When you are dosing your cattle, avoid underdosing those cattle. So this can accelerate parasite resistance, and make sure when you dose your cattle, weigh animals accurately to determine the correct dosage weight. And then another option is to include natural anti-parasitic plant species such as chicory, sainfoin, plantain, and bird's foot trefoil in sward mixes. So this is actually one management aspect that a lot of European farmers have started to look into. Specifically, they've looked into planting sainfoin in their cattle pastures. And it's been shown that small ruminants, when they eat forage mixed with sainfoin, which is this wonderful sward here, it actually reduces the amount of gastrointestinal fecal egg counts of parasites. And this can be seen even at a dietary concentration of between 5 and 8% of having sainfoin in their diet. So even if just 5% of their diet is sainfoin, there's a marked reduction in the amount of fecal egg parasites. So it's also really, really beneficial in cattle pastures because its slow growth makes it really well suited to rotational grazing systems. And within livestock and not just small ruminants, there's an observed decline in Haemoconus contortus, which is the gastrointestinal parasite that affects a lot of cattle in Florida. It's also got high palatability, and it's high in protein, and also planting these kind of crops also has a high importance for biodiversity in ranchlands. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and if anyone's got any questions, please ask.
Great, thank you, Rosie. Great talk. There are some questions in the chat, and I'll just start reading them off to you. Josh Daskin asks, could you revisit your experimental findings regarding the impacts of beetle richness on dung removal? Did you say there was no significant effect? Does that suggest one species can compensate for loss of others? If so, an interesting result given the range of diel behaviors you mentioned at the start.
Okay, so I think this is what he would know. It was not what he was. So yeah, we found that species richness wasn't a significant predictor of dung removal. So it basically means that there's a lot of species that, although they're conducting dung removal, it's more than likely the large roller species and the large tunneler species that are actually, you know, not as abundant as they used to be. So they're not actually contributing that much to dung removal. The abundance of the smaller dung beetles had the highest effect on the amount of dung that was removed. So there might be some functionally redundant dung beetles in the ranchlands. They might not be operating at their full capacity to actually remove dung. Yeah.
You mentioned that we had 29 species in Florida, I think. Are those all native or are they some exotics?
So Florida, of course, bucks the trend in the amount of exotic species that we have here, and that doesn't stop at dung beetles. So we can see, if I go back to the original slide, so those 29 would include introduced species, and it actually includes one dung beetle species that we're actually now considering as an invasive dung beetle. So that's the Digitontophagus gazella dung beetle. I don't know if I can get rid of the picture now. Hopefully, yeah. So that would be this species here, and it was introduced into Georgia, California, Texas, and Louisiana back in the 1970s as a way to get rid of dung on cattle pastures. And it's because it's from East Africa, and a lot of Florida actually resembles, temperature-wise and humidity-wise, actually resembles a lot of East Africa. This species really took off here, and is actually slowly spreading northwards across a lot of the United States. What's been seen when it's, so not only has it spread northwards, it's actually spread all the way down through Mexico, through Honduras, Costa Rica, Guatemala. And in Mexican cow pastures, it's actually competitively excluding the native dung beetles. So there's kind of a lot of worry now that this one species is actually going to cause a lot of the native species to reduce in abundance over the years. In 2 islands in the Caribbean, when this species was introduced, it actually has made 2 of the native dung beetle species regionally extinct or extirpated. So, you know, it is a real threat. and its range is only due to expand with climate change. As soon as the rest of the US starts hotting up, this dung beetle is going to slowly spread northwards and take over pastures in other places. So, yeah.
Interesting. Lots of questions I can foresee with that particular species. There's a question from Rachel Fetters. Prior to cattle ranching, what were the main dung producing species that beetles would have been utilized in Florida?
Oh, that's a really great question. So there's lots of large mammal species, deer, bison, if they were present, used to be a huge contributor to because obviously they're large herbivores too. Right now, I know pigs and cattle were introduced at the same time, but obviously we have a high proportion of pigs. I know there are small mammals too. So Florida is really biodiverse mammal-wise, and I think that's what supports a lot of the dung beetle population, is in that they've got lots of different dung resources to pick from. So before cattle got here in 15th century or so, they were probably supported by a high amount of bison and other grassland ranging species.
So Hillary had a question about the trees, and I have a similar question. So a lot of Florida, like our dry prairies and our wet prairies, had very little tree cover. And that's where a lot of our ranches and our improved pastures are today, sort of converted prairies. Mm-hmm. And we're actually getting more trees on Buck Island than we see in old aerial photos. And we attribute it to changing hydrology. So the ranch is drier now than it was in the past. So but some of these treeless prairies had sort of low shrub cover and palmettos, and these were maintained by the fire regimes. But could these have provided the microclimate that dung beetles needed, not necessarily like tall trees? And we're just slightly worried that you may be arguing for canopy cover in historical grasslands, which are really important for grassland bird biodiversity and conservation of grassland species.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of the things, like historically, when you look at Florida grasslands and the high water table and the amount of large tree species that have a wide canopy cover, historically, what did that actually look like? But having tested soil temperature from underneath palmetto hammocks, underneath smaller vegetation, even that soil temperature is, I think on average, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's around 9 degrees in the summer and 15 degrees Celsius in the summer, cooler than directly outside in the open pasture. And that would provide enough of a refuge for dung beetles to actually be able to, just dig gently into the soil and persist there and wait out the hottest part of the day.
I have another question about, you mentioned climate change and increasing temperatures as being a threat to beetles. And in Florida, some of our biggest changes are proposed to be changes in precipitation. So we might have more intense events. So really dry times of the year, and then sometimes large hurricanes that flood the landscape. And we're even seeing some scenarios where we have enhanced or diminished seasonality. So like wet or dry seasons or dry or wet seasons. That's all. It's very, it has a very high variability in our precipitation already, but would any of those predicted precipitation scenarios affect dung beetles?
Yeah, absolutely. So taking Buck Island, for example, I first started sampling on Buck Island kind of around August, September 2018. And there was a noticeable lack of dung beetles. I compared the data from, there was a master's student who had also sampled Buck Island from 2014 and 2015, and comparing their data and the data I was getting 4 years later, something drastic happened. So I firmly believe the drastic thing that happened was definitely the amount of ground that was inundated with water post-Hurricane Maria and Irma. I know from talking to you guys at the ranch that a lot of the land was underwater for months after. And I feel that had a really, really huge impact on the dung beetle population. We know that dung beetles can't survive in hypoxic soils, so soils that are inundated with water, soils that are becoming routinely flooded. They're just not going to survive in that kind of environment. So going forward with the increase in precipitation that's predicted, yeah, it's going to be a huge, huge problem for sustaining any sort of insects that live in soil. The amount of time and the amount of area that's covered by lands that aren't able to drain quickly enough is going to be a huge, huge impact on all insect species.
So another interesting question here from Aaron David asks, do predators play a role in reducing dung beetle populations? And this particularly makes me think of Kristen Steele's work on fire ants. That's one predator I'm thinking about, but are there other predators, and how do fire ants affect dung beetles?
So right now from Kristen's work, and I can't speak for her directly, I think there was a negligible impact on fire ant mounds existing in pastures with dung beetles. Fire ants and dung beetles coexist in dung pats. If anyone's ever turned over a dry dung pat, you'll know that that's where all the ants are hanging out. You know, they like the shelter, they like the moisture of a dung pat. As for larger animals, yes, birds. Birds specifically. Birds are great predators on any sort of dung beetle in dung pats. I have had traps raided by birds when sampling on ranches. I know it's birds because I've seen their little footprints around each one of the traps. I don't hold it against them. It's fine. Obviously, yeah, any sort of insectivorous animal. When I was working out in Africa, I commonly used to have to get up probably 1 or 2 hours before dawn to go and check dung piles that hadn't been raided by mongoose yet, because I caught so many mongoose raiding dung piles like pre-dawn that they would just walk up to a dung pad and miss through it and eat all of the dung beetles before I'd even get a chance to sample. So yeah, there's lots of predators on dung beetles. It's a great food source. So.
Then last question, I think. So I really liked the table that you had where you suggested different sustainable management techniques on how to sort of coexist with ranching and dung beetles and things that we could do to minimize impact. But is there also a potential seasonal application of ivermectin? I think I remember seeing something where dung beetles are very, they change their populations, their numbers go up and down with different seasons. So could there potentially be a season where you dose cattle with ivermectin that might be less impactful than other seasons?
Absolutely. So dung beetle activity patterns in Florida really drop off from November to kind of the last couple of weeks in February, early March. So as soon as the temperatures start really warming up, dung beetles immediately become more active. So if there was going to be a time that that dosing would happen with veterinary drugs, I suppose, yeah, like around that time, especially in Florida, would be an ideal time, because dung beetles are they're just not out and as active as they are during the summer months. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that's all of our questions. And thank you so much, Rosie. This has been very interesting. Dung beetles are so charismatic, and I just love learning about them.
Yes, they are. Yes. For me, they're much more interesting than, elephants or, any other large mammals. Give me a dung beetle any day. So.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And good luck with the rest of your work.
Okay, great. Thank you, Betsy.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks to Dr. Stanbrook. Like us on Facebook and check out the Archbold website to find out our future seminar offerings, and also subscribe to our newsletter. You'll find all these under the News and Events tab on our website. See you soon.